Welcome to the Practical Spirituality series. The purpose of this series is to share what I have read and learned about how your spirituality can function in everyday life. I like to call it practical spirituality. My goal is to give you some ideas on things like how to acknowledge conflicts and deal with them, how to let negative thoughts wash off of you, and how we attract the right people to associate with. I'm going to review systems that are used for this purpose as well as individual practices. I hope these insights prove beneficial to you and your family. All right, good morning. I'm about ready to begin. If you haven't got coffee and you want coffee, go ahead and start. We'll get rolling here. This is a four-part series, as I said before. What I've tried to do is just put together what I've learned over 25 plus years of doing Lenten series. So, and just kind of coalesce those things and get them together. And the first one, so the first one's going to be on this whole concept of systems and systems theory. And the way I was introduced to systems was I was a rector at Redondo Beach, and one day a woman showed up. And she was, mid-30s, and she said, "I've come here to make amends," and I didn't know what she was talking about. And she said, I'm in an AA program, and part of the thing is to go back and make amends for things. And I used to be the secretary here, and I took these pictures. They were ancient pictures. Christ Church was a church that was over 100 years old, so they had some very ancient pictures of Redondo that she had brought back. And so I got to asking her, how did you get to be the secretary here? And she said, I grew up in an alcoholic family, and my dad was kind of a rageaholic. He used to yell a lot, and I was walking down the street one day and walked into this church on a Sunday morning, and I looked up in the pulpit, and there was Dad, and I just knew where to go. And she said, I just jumped in and to the deep end, both feet. And the next thing you know, I was the secretary and worked here for like 8 years. And for me, that was just an incredible story to hear that. And furthermore, what happened out of that was at the same point in time, I was doing this marriage survey that we do called Prepare and Enrich. And at the end of that, they have 10 questions. And in 10 questions, they can tell you what kind of family you came from. It was just that incredible that you can answer these 10 questions, and they'll tell you whether your family was a kind of a law-abiding, law and order family, if rules changed, all the rest. And just like that, it was just almost miraculous to see how far that had come. And so for me, that became the beginning of just trying to understand that systems are important. And so that's the first part of this series. So the three things I want to look at in terms of family systems. Yes, that is Adolf Hitler's name. We'll get there. I know the only Lenten series in all the United States that has him there. And then John Bradshaw, and then Edward Friedman. And then the first would be Adolf Hitler and the German family. Family systems came from studying Hitler. In other words, the sociological question was, how did this one guy step up and get these people to do these incredible things? I mean, Germany was this incredible country that was very God-fearing, and was a Christian nation, and yet this one person seems to just be able to do that. And the whole point is that they began to look at the family system, the German family system, and that was the key. And so if you look at the German family, the first part is it's autocratic. Mother and children were totally subservient to the father's will, his moods and whims. So basically that was the way the system that most Germans were raised at that point in time. It was all about this father who was basically patriarchal system where he was the most important person, and it was all about obedience. And so the children, they accept humiliation and justice, and basically obedience is the primary rule of conduct. So if you look at Hitler's speeches over and over again, he would be in public and would just rant. It was that ranting that caused people to get in line because they identified with him as their father. And then if you go further, there's a woman named Alice Miller tells a great story about Eichmann. And the point was that during the trials, when he was on trial, he sat impassively while family after family and person after person came up and talked about the terrible things that he had done. And yet, when the judge came in for the reading of the final verdict, Eichmann didn't stand up, and someone reminded him of this, and he was ashamed of himself. In other words, it was that part of obedience that got to him. And that was a place where he was actually ashamed of what he did. It wasn't the things he'd done, it was the fact that he was not obedient to the judge when he re-entered. And so the whole idea of starting, is important, because if you look at most therapists and psychologists will tell us that there are early days when we first come into this earth, we are so dependent on the people in front of us, and those are the ones who impact us. Those are the ones who shape us, and that we take along that role. You see it, and so in this case, you have this family that was so just patriarchal. Everyone's looking at the father, that these people would follow that, and so that became the first part of that. John Bradshaw came along, and so for me, all this began to coalesce together. That woman shows up. I take this marriage course to go ahead and prepare to do premarital counseling, and then this character named John Bradshaw shows up at the same point in time. And Bradshaw, you can see this is one of these cartoons about the whole idea of family systems. And the thing about systems which is important is very complicated. In other words, the people who are doing systems theory are really, really bright. And so the problem with it was that for the normal person, trying to be able to understand them was beyond anything you can fathom. But Bradshaw was the first one who took this really important stuff that only therapists were practicing and knew about, and made it something that everybody else could understand. And so he talks about then the dysfunctional family, and Bradshaw's thing about the family was that 96% of families are emotionally impaired. In other words, and it's nobody's fault, but he said you start looking back at family trees and all the rest, that the sins of fathers and forefathers, as the Bible says, get passed on. And so we don't even know oftentimes what we're dealing with as human beings, or what our parents were dealing with. And so as we come along, we're so dependent upon our parents. They're trying to do their best that they can, and so we get formed and morphed, and we don't even realize it. And so he was the one who goes ahead and really points this out. And again, he talks about the whole thing being like a script, that everyone gets a role, and they were prescribed what feelings they're allowed to feel, what they're allowed to talk about, what they're not allowed to talk about, and everyone kind of gets this script. And so he talks about the fact that he was a hero, and it gets to a point when you fill this role, there gets a spot where therapists will say you don't even know who you are anymore, that you're so following this role that we lose our identity. And what Bradshaw did was this, what I have here is his mobile, because the way he described it is what happens in the family system is if this person, say, is dysfunctional or an alcoholic, as they begin to follow their pattern, the whole rest of the family has to contend with that. So children, anyone else, they all get affected by that personality, and they don't know it. And what they further found out was, and where this really was important, was if that person gets well, in other words, so you have an alcoholic father who somehow goes to AA and he gets well, the problem is the rest of the characters, if they don't get it, are still following those roles. So it's not even about wellness, it's about the whole idea of these roles are being carried out by people who don't even know why they're doing it after a while. So Bradshaw was the one who came up with the mobile and really began to break this down and show people, you know what, this is the way it works, and this is what happens to us, and this is the way we are raised. So he talks about something called shame versus guilt. And guilt would be, I made a mistake. Shame is, I am the mistake. And he has a lot of stuff about just being ashamed, that oftentimes we live in shame-based family systems where we're taught that certain things that we do are wrong, and it's all right there. And oftentimes then religion can come along and say, honor your father and mother. So we do that. The next thing you know, we're acting out something that we don't even know. So again, the one good thing was he was talking about all of our choices depend on our views of ourselves. In other words, as we go along in life, how we see ourselves will determine then choices that we make, and that it all becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so he has a great story about how he was going to visiting a friend in Houston, and his friend was one of those people who's really a nice person who was says hi to everybody and all the rest. And so they're going to go to the mall, and they get in the car, and they start driving to the mall, and he's waving at people and all the rest. And he says they make it to the mall in 20 minutes, just like that. And they had gone along with this young man's father, and the father was kind of a grouchy character. So on the way home, he says, I want to drive home. And so he gets in the car to drive home. And they start off, and Bradshaw's talking to his friend, and he looks up and 20 minutes have gone by and they haven't gotten out of the parking lot yet. And because the whole point is he is kind of grouchy with everybody. And he said the key moment was at one point this little old lady let them in and gave him a spot to get into the line. And he basically said, "What a dumbbell." And his whole contention was that this man, you see, who believes the world is out to get him, that people are flawed, therefore creates his own environment. And that's what we can do in terms of our outlook in life. What we believe about ourselves determines the choices that we make, and then also ultimately will create the bubble, if you will, that we live in. So part of the deal with systems is beginning to understand that whether we like it or not, we all grew up in some kind of system and we work in systems, and so how we behave, what we feel about ourselves is going to determine what we experience in life. Bradshaw uses this quote, "There is only one sorrow, the sorrow of not being a saint." And what that means is it's not about being a saint and being a saintly person, it's about living into who you are. And that was the key about that quote. It's about becoming who you are. In other words, shedding that part of you that's really not who you are and living into who you are. And so he says that hell, in his opinion, is never finding your true self, never living your own life or who you are. And that's the fate at the end of the journey, ever deepening toxic shame. In other words, if we continue to go through life and not really live into the person that we are, that becomes the tragedy. And so he also makes this great statement, though, too, that giving and receiving of unconditional love is the most effective and powerful way to personal wholeness and happiness. Well, what a great statement. In other words, if you think about what we have in the church, you have this capacity to be exposed on a daily basis to an unconditional love of God, and that alone would be enough to begin to practice that, to receive it and practice that would be the way out. So it's not about going, what I'm not encouraging you to do, maybe if you came from a really crazy place, maybe you need therapy. For most of the rest of us, it would be simply about beginning to practice that. And again, I go back to it over and over, but what we do with Catechesis of the Good Shepherd is so integral for that, because most of us, if you're of any age, we grew up in a church where the first exposure we had to God was God, kind of the old man who kind of runs the universe and all the rest. And the children in catechesis, the first God they're exposed to is the loving shepherd who takes them on his shoulders and carries them. And so in that early age, for them to hear of an unconditional love of God, you can imagine what their view of life compared to what some of the rest of our views of life would be like. But that's where they start out, is in that space. So along comes Friedman. And we've done a little bit of talk about Friedman before, but his system stuff was not rooted in the family or in psychology. He was a therapist. It was really about cell biology. He was studying cells and the like and understanding how they worked. And he kind of went a little bit different route than Bradshaw, because Bradshaw was in the space of it was almost deterministic. If you grew up in an unhealthy family system, then you were going to be unhealthy. Friedman begins to say, that's possible, but there's more power for the individual. So he begins to consider something where he looks at the heart, and he says, the heart, you look at what it does, no matter what's happening in the rest of the body or what the brain may be thinking, the heart still does its job. And he begins to talk about this alternative to this mobile spinning around, because what Friedman would say is, yes, it is true that this mobile, if this character here is dysfunctional, everyone turns. But Friedman was the one who said, if one person in the system, when this whole thing is moving around, becomes healthy, that then the system has to stop and bump into that person. So he was the first one to really go a little bit further and say it's not just about this deterministic thing where we're stuck. It's that as we begin to find health and we begin to practice that no matter what system we're in, it has to get healthy because we're there. And so he uses this idea of dominoes, that if you take dominoes and you push them, they all bump into each other and they will continue to go through. And that if that bumping into each other is anxiety, you have several choices. You could either, as one of those dominoes, get out of that line, at which point you would not be a part of it. You could stay in the line and receive the anxiety and pass it on. Or the third one is you could stay in that line, receive the anxiety, and be still. And in doing that, the whole system rotates around the individual. So Friedman was the one who really brought in the idea of the power of one, that when we're in a system, and no matter where these systems are, whether it's family work, or any place else, that we have this incredible capacity, you see, when we're centered and we're coming from this space, to change systems, because they'll have to morph around health as compared to people who are unhealthy. And so again, he was the one who comes up with good leadership can invoke change, remain connected. And Friedman did a lot of work with clergy, because part of his deal was that clergy are in this position more than anyone else, and oftentimes when people are coming to church, they're coming with a lot of that old way of thinking, and that clergy have this capacity, if they can remain in the system, to help people change. But the problem is that most clergy suffer from burnout, because they overfunction, or we overfunction to the point then where people don't get healthy. And so oftentimes church systems are not very healthy. So he did a ton of work in churches and in schools. So when you think about, like me and Earl and James and Linda, if we're operating the two places where he saw the biggest battlegrounds for anxiety, was in these two spaces. So he talks about something called self-differentiation, which is not a static condition, but it's a direction in life. And so it's about not just being in a spot, but what are you moving towards? And knowing where we end and another begins. This idea is that in all good cells, there is a boundary. And oftentimes what happens with us is that as we're participating, whether it be, again, work or family or any place we interact with people, we can lose who we are, because we get absorbed by this other system that keeps poking against us, and it causes us to lose our boundaries. And he says, so the key of the kingdom is not intelligence, creativity, self-confidence, all those things we're told. It's just maintaining or staying and living true to yourself. That was the key. And that, again, it's that whole concept of seek first the kingdom and everything else gets added. But most of the time we're looking for, how can I be more self-confident? All the rest. Friedman, we keep going back to, be actualized. When you stay within yourself and live into who you are, all those things will come. If you try to find confidence, you're going to miss the point. So again, so he talks about this thing of a non-anxious self as compared to an anxious, a non-self. So the poorly differentiated, he says, they're like viruses. These are like other people that might be in your world. They latch onto other poorly differentiated persons and creating triangles. So part of Friedman and Bradshaw said the same thing, that the odd part of life is that we almost put out vibes. And if we're in an unhealthy spot, you're going to attract unhealthy people. And then when you get into a healthier place, you attract healthy people. And so that every day we're waking up, the number one charge for us is to be healthy. And when we stay healthy, then we begin to create this world about us that's different. But otherwise, you can attract other people who are not healthy in their life and wonder how they got there. He always would say, don't change your friends, change yourself. Because when you change yourself, you will change your friends. But as long as we're still running through friends, or basically people we're hanging around when we determine they're not good for us, without really looking at who we are, we're going to miss the point. So again, he talks about triangles. That triangles are the subset for all systems. It always starts with three. And so his contention is that when we're in groups of three, and Jim Adams, you might know, is a psychologist, and one time he said the same thing. He said, the number three is the reason I have a job. Is that, in other words, when groups of three, a triangle is what causes most of the problems. And therefore, when three people gather together, it's very difficult for all three to be in union with each other. Basically, there's always an odd person out. And so at first, triangles are seductive, because it feels like somebody else is saying to you, you and I are okay, but what about so-and-so? And so therefore, it's easy to go ahead and buy into that, but once we do, we get into this triangle that's not good for us. And so his contention is the number one cause of stress and burnout is getting stuck in other people's problems. The number one cause of stress and burnout is we get stuck and we're taking on other people's stuff. And so that when we're self-differentiated and we know who we are, then we'll be fine. But when we start dragging and picking up and carrying around other people's stuff, we get worn out. And again, that was his whole point with clergy, and oftentimes where workspace disorders, is that we're basically, that's the issue. We're tired, not because of the work itself, but because we're taking on other people's problems. And so part of his deal was tolerating the discomfort of others encourages them to take responsibility. So at some point, it's about being in the system, but not of it. So in other words, it's not solving other people's problems, but being able to make observations. So you stay in the situation, you're not judgmental about it, but you don't try to fix everything. And it's that staying in the middle of that that gives power to the situation, because it allows the person then to deal with what they're dealing with. Otherwise, what we end up doing is we keep fixing it, we just perpetuate the situation. So his contention is, you stay in it, you just don't have to do everything about it. Friedman's got this great fable. You might remember Keith read it several years ago, and I got it printed out. I can get a copy for it if you want it. But it tells this great story about a man who sets out on a journey. And he's on this journey. He comes up to this bridge. And on this bridge is another gentleman. The gentleman has a rope, and it's tied around his waist. And the gentleman says to this man, would you take the end of this rope for a minute? So the man takes the rope, and the gentleman jumps over the edge. And he is hanging. And so the guy starts saying, like, hey, I'm supposed to get on my way. I have someplace to be, and you can't let go of that rope. You get let go of that rope, I'm going to die. That's it for me. And so there's this back and forth dialogue that goes on for quite a while, where this gentleman's holding the rope. He's trying to do the right thing, but he can't let go, because if he lets go, this other person at the end of the rope will fall in the creek. And it's this really great, it's called a fable that he has, a great fable just about how in life we can do that. We get stuck holding on to other people's problems and all the rest of that. And the dialogue is fascinating. At the end, the gentleman finally lets go of the rope. And years later, he wrote an epilogue to the story. And the story is that, of course, this guy walks away feeling terrible about what he's done. He let this man fall into the creek. He's probably dead. The story goes on, though, that once this gentleman leaves, with a life probably feeling guilty for the rest of his life, the one who fell in the creek gets up, dresses himself off, climbs up to the bridge, reties the rope, and waits for the next person to come along. And that's what ends up happening if we're not careful, as we just go on and we think that these are life and death situations, and oftentimes people are looking for us to take on their problems, and it's when we can stop and just, again, not withdraw from the situation, but be a part of it. That becomes the key, is to stay in the middle of things, but not take on the anxiety. When we do that, we create health. And if you look at that in Jesus' life, over and over again, that's what he was doing. He was not taking responsibility for other people's things. So there were very few cases where Jesus, if any cases, where Jesus walked into a city and saw somebody and walked over to them to heal them. What he dealt with is when people came to him and said, I have an issue, then he stopped and met that person where he was. But he was not about going and trying to fix the universe, because the universe was not part of his mission, if you will, and it really was unfixable at some point. With free will, these things were going to happen. So he's just very clear every place he goes in terms of dealing with people right where they are, but again, not taking on their issues or problems. So again, self-differentiation, love your neighbor as yourself. A self-differentiated person is going to have these qualities. First one is a clarity about life's goals. In other words, what's your purpose in life? What are you about? Sticking close to that. It's going to be about, basically, this Sunday's sermon is about this same concept. What is your purpose? What do you do? I mean, if you look at Rick Warren, he wrote a whole book on the purpose-driven life. And I'll never forget, no knock at Rick Warren. Read the book, it's kind of like, we do that every day. There was I didn't really need a book. We say every day, send us out into the world, to do what you're called us to do. That's our job every day, that we say that last prayer when we go out into the church. This is what we're called to do, is go out and be the person that we're called to be and have a purpose in life. That this time in life is short. You have things to do. But again, to live into who you are. If we do so, we're going to be less likely to be caught up in anxious and emotional processes swirling about. In other words, if we're clear about our purpose, then there's less opportunity for other things to intervene. When we're not clear about our purpose, then we can take on, it's almost like we have more spots where things are going to stick. But when we're clear about who we are and about what we do, then we don't have the capacity to take on other people's stuff. Again, and we can separate ourselves and yet be connected. And again, that's the important part, because sometimes what we hear when we say we're not supposed to solve other people's problems is that we're going to withdraw. And again, the whole system, it's not about withdrawing. It's about staying in the middle of something, and staying connected, but just not solving everything. And then we can maintain a modifying, non-anxious, even and even challenging presence. So we can stay in that situation, we can modify, we can be non-anxious, and even challenge. But again, getting that part and understanding that when we're in the middle of this situation, that's our gift, is to do that, but again, not take things on. So again, why system spirituality? Why would we start here? And it seems to me some points that I know that really have helped me in my life. The first one is gives us permission not to personalize others' behavior. In other words, when you get that other people are perhaps reading a script, depending on where you are, if you're a boss of a company or whatever, oftentimes what they're saying has nothing at all to do with you. In other words, they are working on something that's their script. It's not yours. So when you're hearing, Friedman's really big on, when you're hearing lots of criticism or something, you're probably on the right path if you're in a system that's kind of broken up. So that's okay. But again, it's when you're hearing people put things on you, it's not your deal. It's just where they're coming from. So it gives you permission not to take things personally and just to understand that that's where they are. That's okay. Maybe they're going through a bad stretch, but you don't have to go ahead and absorb everything. The second thing for me was important is when we're unhealthy, we're going to attract unhealthy persons. So when you get to a spot in life, look around at your newest friends and you can kind of tell where you are, but understanding that we're oftentimes putting off a vibe, if you will, almost like a signal. And so again, what you're attracting, what's coalescing around you will tell you where you are. Opposite is also true. Again, when you're more healthy, you're going to find that there's an atmosphere of health that begins to follow and surround you. The power of one is essential. In other words, the whole idea here is that systems theory is great about understanding that up to that point, there was always a sense of the majority. The majority was the most important thing. In systems theory, especially when Friedman came along, the power of one person is everything. And we see that throughout the world. In other words, when you look at the great movements, whether it be Mother Teresa or Jesus Christ or Martin Luther King or Gandhi, it's one person that makes the difference. It wasn't this whole group. It's one person who's standing in a spot, living out who they are, that then coalesces and other people come around them. That's how things get done in the world. But we oftentimes miss that. We keep thinking we're looking for consensus or trying to get majority, and that's not the case. It's just to be our authentic selves, and when we do that, we have much more power than we can possibly comprehend. All right. That's my first round.